Meet new and exciting people every day on the Discovery Channel.
Looking back at it now, it was quite a thing to have lived through that First World War. And at that time, planes were in a very early state of development. Engine failures and forced landings were part and parcel of flying. But during the intervening period, we were to see flying grow up in a way which has been quite astonishing.
Contact!
When I fly in the sky, they all cry as I pass by. Hammond, Hammond, don't put the wind up me. Odie, odie, oh, when I fly round the town, knocking people down.
The end of War One had found me in a field dressing station. I was herniated and in a bit of a mess, I'll tell you. Oh dear, I was sent down for a quick recovery at Cap Martin, which is down on the French coast near to Menton, and having done that, back to England and into hospital Eden Square. Here was I. The war was at an end. I was lying in bed looking at the flowers with nothing to do. Gave me time to think things over and think things over. What was going to happen now? Do you know that in those days, aviation could have just gone any old way? Cool. But nevertheless, other people were getting something done. Alcock and Brown had a crack, were taking a crack at the Atlantic. That was the big thing at the time. In fact, it was the biggest thing. They succeeded in getting across the Atlantic, as everybody knows. And it interested me very much because at this time, the ferry company, amongst others, were intending to do the same thing. They were getting a machine ready for it. I was in touch with the ferry company, but the fact of Alcock and Brown achieving the job put a stop to that, and that was that. But I don't begrudge Alcock and Brown their success in doing it, believe me. But it put me out. Anyhow, it did seem to me that they did prove up to the hilt that aviation had a real future. That was the great thing. And during peacetime, too. The aeroplane had virtually come into existence over this war that we'd just been through. And it was no more, when you examine it, it was no more than a long-range gun. I, on the other hand, had actually used an aircraft as transport. When I was at Beachbourne, I used to nip into my camel and over to the Hainault farm, for you could say Nigel Jack Robinson. On the other hand, it was going to cost a lot of money. There was a pilot to be paid, petrol to be bought, and all sorts of things. And so the conclusion I came to was that it was very unlikely that people would start as passengers flying in the air, how wrong I was, but males. The normal way way of carrying mails out to the east in those days. The mail was rushed across, down to Dover, across to France, right across France, down into Italy, to Trieste. And at Trieste, the P&O had a couple of special steamers, the Isis and the Osiris, which had ripped their mails across to Port Said, where they caught the mail steamer which had left Tilbury a fortnight before. This thing was very much on my mind, and I had myself gradually completely convinced that mails, as a particular thing, were going to move up from the sea into the air. And the shipping companies, such as the P&O, for instance, are the people who would profit most by getting the mails up from sea level to air level.
And so, one of the big events of my life, I talked my way into the boardroom of the P&O company.
The directors thought I was crackers or I was putting up a leg pull, and one of them made some excuse for going away, and not very long after that the other one made an excuse for going away. I was left there sitting by myself wondering what next. The commissioner came in and said the interview was at an end, good morning, and that was that.
I was convinced that they were making a big mistake, because I knew myself that during the latter part of the war, when I was in France, the Army and Air Force mail was already being sent from London by aeroplane to keep the troops happy. What was I going to do now? Just a grounded aviator.
I had a bit of romance going about this time, and I badly wanted to dodge going back to Siam if I could possibly do it. Anyway, I was still very convinced that something was going to happen in flying.
Fine, ladies and gentlemen, we'll show you how this works.
If an airship could cross the Atlantic and return safely, surely a sky car was within our endeavors. Hey. And so, back to Siam I went.
It was while I was in Siam that news came through that Ross Smith was having a dart at the Australia time. And he, in fact, landed in Siam, and I went up to Don Mueang to see him. I even took a photograph while I was up there. And it's Ross Smith who's out there on the wing. The chap in the front of the picture is simply the agent of one of the oil companies. At this time, there was a very interesting situation. The sea mail to then British-owned Rangoon took 19 days to get out, whereas the mail to Bangkok took 30 days. And a little jump from Rangoon across to Bangkok would get us our mail in Bangkok into 20 days instead of 30. And I took a very strenuous crack at this one, but I couldn't bring it off. It would have seemed that my ideas were in advance of their time again. Damn it.
But Siam felt the effects of the slump, which was absolutely engulfing the whole world at this time. And my job was axed. The ground cut away from under my feet. Home I came.
Unemployment. Those idling on Britain's streets numbered 1.75 million. Under government schemes, many jobless and their families emigrated to the Dominion. For those who stayed, prosperity seemed further away than ever.
But actually, compared with many, many people, I was very lucky. Back in London, the only thing I had to support myself with was a war gratuity of 600 quid.
So feeling my way around and finding that there were no jobs at all from the flying point of view, I eventually bought myself a little business in Limehouse in making a product called Suji Muji, which was used in Victorian days for cleaning ship's decks.
And it had its lighter moments. Yes, it had.
It was now, of course, 1922. And also back in England were Ross and Keith Smith, who now held the England-Australia record. They were building a new amphibian for a flight around the world, but while on test, the plane crashed, carrying Ross Smith to his death. Tragic it was.
Britain held her first glider meets, and the thrills of engineless flight captured the imagination of many.
You must remember that gliding in those days was almost in the same state that hang gliding is today. It was very much hit and miss. Matter of getting your glider off the ground. And which was done in all sorts of ways by getting a lot of Boy Scouts to tow you with a bit of rope and all this sort of thing. Now, the one that Lander invented out of his own head was doing it with an elastic band. Onto the nose of the glider, he tied his elastic and stretched it out and tied it to a fence at the far end of the field. Having tied his tail of the glider down before he did this, he then got into the glider, got somebody to loose the tail off, and the elastic succeeded in perfectly successful taking it off the ground and starting his glide going. But unfortunately, in the long run, Lander broke his neck.
In France, Monsieur Pescara was perfecting his helicopter.
And in 30 seconds, Mr. Beccara's machine rose to the staggering height of 3 feet into the air.
Now, this time, people were becoming a little bit more interested in flying. I remember turning up at the new Croydon Airport to see the planes take off for the first King's Cup air race. That was a thing, right up to Glasgow and back.
Enthusiasts followed the race hour by hour. The winner was F.L. Barnard, who flew the course at the average speed of 120 miles an hour.
1923 could have seen the end of my flying days. The RAF came along with the clever idea of starting RAF Reserve. There was no flying going on at all. The flying manufacturing companies were at a standstill. Instead of sending us to RAF stations to do our bit of flying, they had the clever idea of passing us on to the various aircraft manufacturers and giving them a fee for teaching us. We also took a small fee for doing our little bit of flying, so believe me, off I went to Stag Lane to the Havilands. Where dear old Avro, one of the dear, there's more affection attached to an Avro than any aeroplane there is in the sky.
I'm an airman, and I fly, 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 up in the sky, ever so high. Sparrows, they can't catch me, because I fly so high. I'm an airman, and I fly, 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 fly. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wish I was at the bar. La da, 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 da. I fell in love with a girl named Sis. She told me she was a single miss. But when her husband came on view, I said as he said, who are you? I'm an airman, and I fly, 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 fly. Up in the sky, ever so high. Because I fly so high, I'm an airman, I'm the she-call-vera-by.
To fly all over again, and this was for the second time in my young life.
I came across an ad one time of somebody who was hoping to meet, would like to meet somebody who had an airplane to do some flying for them. I hadn't got an airplane, but nevertheless I was willing to do a bit of flying for anybody. I answered this ad and found myself with none other than Lady Beauchamp. Lady Beauchamp had a couple of sons, Adrian and Tommy, and Adrian, the elder of the two, was crackers on meteorology, and he badly wanted temperatures around clouds and that sort of thing. If I could find an aircraft which could be obtained at a reasonable price, we'd get the job going. Suited me absolutely down to the ground. I started trekking all over the place. I remember one of the first I came across was a caudron sitting in a field behind a pub in Rochester, and the cows were nibbling at it. An aviator had arrived in this caudron, stayed for a pub, stayed at the pub for some while, dodged off without paying his bill, and that was that. Had been there ever since. And then, what a wonder, there suddenly came into the picture an Avro 504K. What do you think of that? It was in pretty bad shape, I might tell you, and it was on Hendon Aerodrome, tucked in the way back of a hangar. Wanted quite a lot of work on it. I used to come up every weekend, and a friend of mine, Valentine, his girlfriend, used to come and make us tea, and we put in time and time and time to bring it up to the standard of getting it C of A. I might tell you that this Avro cost £90.
Going up, way up, that's the aeroplane flies.
I stuck the thermometer onto one of the struts where I could see it from the pilot seats and flew around the cloud, getting the temperature which Adrian wanted, while he studied from his own apparatus on the ground.
Just push those clouds aside. Going up, going up, going up, way up, that's the aeroplane glide.
Solo, I'll be with you later. Later, boys.
About this time, there was one flying chap that we always used to call the Flying Professor, because his daring antics thrilled everyone, and how people envied him his undercarriage. The mid-20s in flying was an age of daredevils and heroes, I'll tell you. Those who survived the risks became the heroes, and the newspapers and the newsreels absolutely reveled in them.
You don't see a Birdman every day, so Movietone is on the spot to shoot the human eagle in flight. He's an American, Mr. Clem Song. Now let's see if we can photograph him as he swoops with wings spread but parachute unopened towards the ground. We can, and he does. A unique picture of an amazing feat. Nearing Earth, he opens his umbrella and lands safely.
Mary Jane, she'd look swell in an aeroplane. She wouldn't murmur if I should dare ask her to marry me up in the air, for it's Mr. Right, honor right. You have us lovers insane, way up in an aeroplane. Mary's papa is a queer old gent. He doesn't fancy me for a cent. Wants her to marry some millionaire with the gold, so I'm told. Mary is wise to his little game. She says she'll marry me just the same, for she heard me say we would fly someday, and that won her heart right away. Mary Jane, Mary Jane, she'd look swell in an aeroplane. She wouldn't murmur if I should dare ask her to marry me up in the air, for it's Mr. Right, honor bright. You have us lovers insane. Such elegant chances for Cupid's advances. up in an aeroplane.
Flying circuses were tremendous fun, and it just reminds me of an incident before the war. People used to come all the way up the Edgware Road in a green Pioneer motorbus for 5p, as far as I remember it, to see these miraculous flying machines.
And along came a chap one day who said that he was prepared to leap out of one of these aeroplanes in a parachute, and he would get a £5 for doing it. His parachute was a lot of wires and fabric and cloth and that sort of thing, all clutched in the man's arms. And they didn't want this to get entangled with the aeroplane. And so they arranged that he should sit actually on the skid of the undercarriage. One of the mechanics was to sit behind him with his legs around one of the struts, and at a sign from the pilot, he was to kick him off into space, which is what he did. Which is what he did. Down he went, unraveling the parachute jolly good and hard as he went down. The parachute opened up, and he landed in the middle of the aerodrome, came and picked up his £5 and went away to give his wife her housekeeping money. The following week he came along and did it again, same routine entirely, but unfortunately rather miscalculated the point at which they kicked him off. And so instead of landing in the aerodrome, he landed in the field alongside the aerodrome. The crowd naturally stampeded across the field, trampled down all the crop, and the farmer threatened to sue. It cost the parachute chap 10 quid, and so the money which he'd earned by these two parachute tops just went west.
It was in the early part of 27 that Lindbergh came into the picture, and he caught the world's imagination just as Alcock and Brown had done.
Lindbergh, who, like everyone else I read about in the papers, was over the Atlantic. He was over the Atlantic in 34 hours, 3,700 miles of it. And I raise my hat for that.
And I remember, too, the thrill that we all got when England won the Schneider Trophy at the incredible speed of over 400 mph. Nothing much today, but a hell of a business then.
It was in Germany at this time that Opel's rocket-powered plane made its first flight. And that really made history. It was the beginning of the rocket era.
In this same year, 1929, that is, the slump came. This Wall Street crash was a thing of world magnitude. It jolly well put paid to all any thoughts of air records, anything of that kind. It ushered in a really, really deadly dull, dreaded crash period. I had a conviction that the way out of the slump was for everybody to make an effort of some kind, however small. The accumulative effect of 50 million small efforts by the whole of the population would get us out of the slump. In any case, I decided that I should do something about it myself. But what was I to do? Pretty obvious it must be something to do with flying. Now, I'd better remind you that in the previous year, that was 1928, Bert Hinkler made his record to Australia in 16 days.
Subsequent to this, Amy Johnson came into the field, which you'll also remember too, and she did succeed in getting through to Australia, but did not succeed in reducing Hinkler's time.
Morning, Miss Ross.
May I have a bath out?
Do you want it right now?
Yes, I want to hop off right away.
Right on, Bird. Give Miss Ross a machine out. Okay.
Now, Amy Johnson, of course, after her effort on the Australia record, was everyone's heroine. I had met her at Stag Lane one time, and very great respect for Amy Johnson. She was a very fully qualified pilot, and this, don't forget, was in the days before women's lib had ever arisen. She did not actually break Hinkler's record. Hinkler's record stood at 16 days. And Amy Johnson's time actually turned out, by the time she'd beaten her way right through, it turned out to 20 days. And that was that, which meant that Hinkler's record still stood unbroken, which was the part that interested me, because my objective was this, that I had unusual experience of night flying, very unusual experience of night flying, on top of which puss moth has been developed, and puss moth enabled one to fly inside instead of sitting out in the open. And with those two factors, the factor of using an aircraft which you could sit inside, for one thing, and the fact of my having had this exceptional experience of night flying, set me onto the idea of cracking Hinkler's time into half. And that's what I set myself out to do. Over this period, I'd met a chap called Pickthorne, who was also very keen indeed on having a crack at the Australia record. And so we raised enough money to pay for the puss moth and carry us on our way. I left home one morning for the purpose of going over to Stag Lane to pick up the puss moth, which was waiting there, everything in readiness, to take her over to Croydon, from where we were going to kick off on our job. A thing happened. While I had been at Stag Lane, a newspaper chap had come along and done a bit of chattering, and I had particularly told him that I particularly wanted to keep this thing unheralded until either I was successful or not successful. This chap didn't take this very seriously, and just shortly after I left home, a knock at the door, and there was this journalist. And he saw my mother and said, "Oh, I've come to talk to you about your son who's just started on a crack at the Australia record." My mother said, "Don't be silly, he's done nothing of the kind, he's just gone to the office, as usual." Well, then the journalist kept on about it and convinced her that I had gone on to start on this Australia record thing. And all my mother said, "Then I'm sure he'll do it," she said. Patriotic mother.
Anyhow, at the same time as we were starting off, the R101, which was a great new airship development which had just completed its pre-flight preparations, was also starting off on its first Empire air route. They'd even got the mooring mast ready for it at Karachi.
And you know, it would have been on the 5th of October. It was on the 5th of October in 1930 that after this toing and froing and all sorts of things, Pickthorne and I eventually got going from Croydon, and I might tell you, into the filthiest weather. I've flown in some filthy weather, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this was something like the filthiest weather I've ever flown. It really was a stink.
It was the same weather, of course, which the R101 had been flying in.
When we landed in Belgrade, the first news we picked up from anywhere was the R101, of course, and how she'd gone down in flames in France and utter destruction. Too sad.
You're now looking at the airship 101. This ship was on its way from England to India. It had 57 people on board, approximately, including the Minister of Air, Lord Thompson.
Out of the crew and passengers of this airship, there were exactly 7 survivors. And that was stark tragedy.
Well, in Belgrade, we were well on our way. The next stage being Baghdad, and so we refueled can after can, and taxied around to take off to Baghdad. Rain had been pouring down onto this and every other place there was, and as we ploughed across the aerodrome trying to take off, all we did was to plough our wheels deeper into the mud. What are we going to do? We've got to get off! And so we opened the cocks and we poured away the petrol that we just bought and paid for, leaving ourselves just enough to make Constantinople instead of making Baghdad according to our plan. It just came off. By this time, several other pilots were filled with the same idea. A race was on. But in the meantime, we'd lost our lead, and Hill had caught us up in Constantinople. Kingsford Smith had overtaken us, caught up with Hill, and he'd gone on to beat the record time.
Flyers? Don't talk to me about flyers. That year the sky was plastered with it. Yeah, that year on Broadway there was more paper than rain. Everybody gets a great kick out of it. Everybody except me. I work in the street cleaning department.
I might tell you that during the whole of the time that I was renovating this house, my mind was still working the whole jolly time on air events and air developments, no matter what they might be. An excerpt from Hansard in 1933.
I suggest to the government that the main future of an air force should be to develop civil aviation for tourist, pleasure, commercial purposes. As a weapon, either of offense or defense, it should cease to be considered.
Some members of Parliament never cease to amaze me.
Looks like you had your gas bags, too. I know we did. In the U.S. Navy, we spend most of our time with our heads in the clouds. We stuck our necks way out. The trouble with them big airships was, you spend half the day getting them up, and the other half getting them down again. What with getting them up, getting them down, it's not surprising they never got no place.
But in 1933, many things had got no place. The Depression was worldwide.
Acute depression brought its own reaction. And in the United States, with true American lavishness, even escape was on the grand scale.
Poor old Austin 7. This car was offered to me by a clerical gentleman who was teaching in a school somewhere for quite a silly price. Well, one morning I was having breakfast and there was a tap at the window, and outside the window was my clerical gentleman, and I just sillily said, "Oh, don't you come worrying me here like that." Just sort of leg pull. I have a silly habit of talking like that. And he said, "Oh, you've heard, have you?" And I said, "Of course I've heard." What I'd heard, I hadn't the faintest idea. But in any case, he said, "Well, I've come in any case. You know, I'm leaving, as you might imagine. I'm leaving. And you said something about having a motor car. I'd be most pleased if you would take it off my hands." So I said, "Yes, all right, yes, I will." So-and-so, we talked about the price already. And he said, "Well, that means I'm going now, as you'll quite understand. So I wonder if you'd drive me to the station." "All right." And so I got out and got in the motor car. Well, on the way to the station, there transpired a thing that I did not know at all, which was that he had been caught out at interfering with the boys at the school that he was connected with, and was leaving very suddenly. There's only one thing I do remember on the way to the station. He said it's so unfortunate that my bishop was not handling the case, because he would have understood. But in that same year, 33, there were still outstanding aviation events happening.
Up through the haze over the dusty plains of India, up into the crystal clear skies of the Himalayas. Ridge after ridge, peak after peak, and then Everest.
through the icy blizzard streaming off the summit. Above 30,000 feet. And we were over. Over by only 100 feet. But it was 100 feet over the roof of the world.
Cool. That would have been a flight which I'd like to have done. I would indeed.
This uninviting coastline is all that Mrs. Beryl Markham saw when she flew out of the fog over Nova Scotia.
She'd managed to cross the Atlantic from east to west. The first woman solo to do so. And remember, it was only 1936. She'd crash-landed when her petrol ran out, but she was only slightly hurt.
Mrs. Markham gets a heroine's ovation at Floyd Bennett. Plaster on her forehead, she is soon plied with questions.
I am so pleased to have got here. I only wish I could come in my own machine. Down.
It was a hard battle against the elements above the ocean, fog and storm. But pluck and endurance crowned one of the most grueling flights on record. Mrs. Markham, just what were you thinking about while flying through all that fog and storm?
Well, my one thought and ambition was to get to America.
When above the sea, what did you eat or drink?
I didn't have anything until the last half hour when I had a friggate of brandy.
Just one?
No, two, I'm afraid.
At that time, but I got married. In the early days, when I first knew my wife, she, with the consent of her parents, used to come and travel around the country with her quite a lot. And in this way, she got rather a hunch on traveling around.
Why don't you cure the blues with a cruise? 12 pounds for 12 days. 12 long, exotic days under romantic skies. Why not take her with you and get away from it all?
But the plan which I developed was for a long, long, long trek right across Europe, India, China. And so for the trip, I designed and built a special caravan which was horse-drawn.
I'll go home and pack my panties, you go home and get your scanties, and away we'll go. Off we're gonna shuffle off to Buffalo.
To Niagara in a sleeper, there's no honeymoon that's cheaper, and the train goes slow. Off we're gonna shuffle off to Buffalo.
And so we arrived in France. But, oh dear, Hitler started looking very ominous, and one didn't know what was going to happen next. So I altered my overall plan to France, Italy, and Greece, excluding Germany. Then, following Hitler looking awkward across Europe, Mr. Mussolini was now looking awkward indeed across our other proposed route, and the only reasonable thing to do was to mark time and see what was going to happen. Incidentally, before I started this, I had gone to an old chap called Ferrara, and old Ferrara had given me just a few lessons in how to work a 16mm cine. So I wrote a scenario, jolly good one I think, on the wine industry of France, 1,000,000 years in a bottle.
Johnny's heart went pity-pity-pat somewhere in sunny France. He met a girl by chance with the naughty gland. She looked just like a kitty cat. She loved to dance and play. So he learned no French. When he left the trench, he knew well enough to say,
Oh, that's me.
Marie,
That's me.
will you do this for me? Oui, oui, Marie. Then I'll do that for for you. I love your eyes, they make me feel so gloomy. You drive me loony, you're teasing me. Why can't we polly-boo like other sweethearts do? I want a kiss or two from our chérie. Oui, oui, Marie. If you'll do this for me, then I'll do that for you. Oui, oui, Marie.
The fateful hour of 11 has struck, and Britain's final warning to Hitler having been ignored, a state of war once more exists between Great Britain and Germany.
Nothing more happened than that, and I just went on making the film. When the Germans advanced through Belgium, they were threatening Paris. At that point, the war really started. Refugees steamed across Europe in the direction of Bordeaux. So I went into Bordeaux to find out what the position was. I found the place absolutely seething solid with people, and I was told that the very last ship that was possible to get away from was going to leave, and if I didn't get into that ship, there was no chance of getting out at all. And I was desperate, wouldn't know what to do. And a man in the crowd said, "Would you like a motor car? Have mine. I don't want it any longer," and gave me a motor car as a present right on that spot. I said, "Thank you very much." Got in his motor car, rushed off to Mérignac, picked up my wife, tore back into Bordeaux, and got into this ship. No sort of luggage at all was going to be allowed. The caravan, cameras, the whole jolly lot. We were supposed to take simply enough to eat and nothing else at all. She was licensed to carry 123 passengers, I remember, and no fewer than 3,000 of us swarmed into this ship. And I arrived with blisters on my hip bone.
If you'll do this for me, then I'll do that for you. Oui, oui, Marie.
This was 1939. The war was going on. I was having nothing to do with it at all. And of course, the key factor of the whole jolly thing was that, unalterable, I was over 50 years of age. One day there was an ad in the papers about the RAF was requiring people for admin jobs. I really hadn't got much of an idea what admin jobs might be, nothing to do with me. And in any case, I went and saw these people, did an ordinary sort of interview, and they looked me over and up and down and this and that and the other, and they finally said, "Well, you're just about the sort of chap we want. Let's have your name and address and number and all that sort of thing, we'll let you know." "But I don't really want your job." "Well, what are you doing?" "I really want to get back into flying." "Oh, don't be silly, you can't do that." Hopeless. But nevertheless, he said, there's a thing which is a little bit nearer to flying. Do you know anything about link trainers? I had the faintest idea what a link trainer was. Anyhow, he put me on to link trainers. I went and saw the link trainer people, and they finally did the same thing. They said, "Let's have your particulars and all that, and we'll let you know." And again, I said, "I don't really want your job. I want to get back into flying." "Oh, don't be silly." Anyhow, in the course of this, I had picked up the name of the people who were interviewing for flying. I said, "I've been passed on to you by the other people because they think I ought to go back into flying." They agreed that I should go before a selection committee. Air Marshal and Admiral and what have you. And I put my case to them, and they said, yes, that's all right, Chabot, but don't be ridiculous, you wouldn't get through the medical." "May I try, sir?" What I hadn't told them was that way back in 29, owing to a mistake in a hospital, I had had a kidney removed. I got a great seam up my side like this, like a eider-down blanket. And I knew perfectly well that directly this thing came to light, I'd had it. An Air Force medical is a bit of a thing. They do your eyes, la la la. They do your ears, la la la. They do everything. I scraped through it this, and I scraped through it that, and I scraped through it the other. And I still had not got to the chap who says, "Take your clothes off." And so they said, well, there's only one more item for you to do. Go downstairs to Dr. So-and-so. It was getting quite late. He looked up and said, oh, no, not another one. I'm sick of this. I'd had enough of this all day. Wait a minute, pass the paper over here. Ever had any tropical diseases? Oh, yes, I've had stand-by fever. And ever had malaria? No, I haven't had malaria. Ever had any operations? No, let me see. Yes, sir, I once had tonsils out, I remember. Anything else? Yes, I broke a leg once. Anything else? No, I don't think so. He went on and eventually got to the end of the paper. Signed on the dotted line, signed on and reached for my hat. Oh dear, we've got through that one. But, just take your clothes off, will you? This whole day's work was all busted under my face, just like that. Off my clothes had to come. I turned my side to him without the gash on it. He wandered around to the other side and said, oh, I suppose that's where they took your tonsils out, is it? And I was in. I was in. I was in. I was back in the RAF. Grand.
And though it's pretty tough, the job he has to do, I wouldn't have him change it for a king. An ordinary fella in a uniform of blue, he wears a pair of silver wings.
And who was to know that in another 35 years I'd still be getting in and out of cockpits and flying, but this time at twice the speed of sound.